Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And we're returning to our reading and discussion of the book, The History of Romanism, by John Dowling. And we are talking about that period of time in history when the papacy had already achieved his Lord of Lords status and universal bishop and head of all the churches, the head of all Christendom. But there lacked one hurdle yet for the papacy to rise to the level of the man of sin, or the son of perdition, or rather the beast of Daniel. He must achieve first temporal sovereignty and become King of Kings as well as Lord of Lords. To be the God of this world, the papacy must yet achieve temporal sovereignty, King of Kings. Now, at this point of the reading, like I said before, the papacy had achieved what we would call his Lord of Lords status, head of all the churches, and now he is digging, scratching, and clawing his way to temporal sovereignty. By every sort of intrigue, lies, deceptions, extortions, every means at his disposal to elevate himself to kingly status in the world. And what lay in his path to achieving this temporal status was the emperors. The Roman emperors were restraining his rise to power. At this point, the papacy had to be approved by the emperor. In other words, if a new pope was elected, he could not ascend to the papal throne until the emperor co-signed his election or approved his election. And the popes who had received from the emperor their Lord of Lords status now wanted to do altogether away with the emperor and elevate themselves to papal status without the consent of the Caesars, without the consent of the emperors. And so they literally were trying to topple the ladder by which they clawed their way to the Lord of Lords status, the emperors. Okay? So if they're going to do away with the emperors, common sense would dictate that they would thus give up their spiritual sovereignty, which they received from the emperors. And so, and like I said before, this is just simply God showing that the papacy is not sanctioned by God. It's not a power of God. It's not any kind of divine right authority whatsoever. Look, if God truly, as the Roman Catholic Church suggests, maintains the papacy, why would it have to resort to such intrigue and such Herculean effort to struggle to achieve both lordship and kingship status in the world? The papacy has not risen to its current lustful position in the world by divine right. It has done it through sheer effort and force. And thereby we know that this is not an institution established by God. This is, as all Protestants throughout history have attested, this is the Antichrist of the Bible. The papacy is the Antichrist of the Bible. Now, beginning in subsection 4 on page 135, we'll continue the reading. Now, he's speaking about this restrainer. The Caesars were standing in the way of the popes elevating themselves to temporal sovereignty. The emperor first had to approve the papacy before he could rise to his throne in Rome. And it says, the popes, however, were restless under this odious restraint. They had reached by means of the emperors the height of spiritual supremacy, And now the popes were anxious to knock away that ladder by which they had attained this eminence, render themselves independent of all earthly governments, that is, the Caesars, the emperors, and assume a rank among the temporal sovereigns of the earth. And they watched with eagle gaze for every opportunity of confirming and enlarging their power. Okay? So now we're engaged in a power struggle between the popes and the kings of the earth, the emperor of the Roman Empire. And he says, one remarkable instance of this occurrence in the appointment by the sole authority of the Pope in 667 of Theodore as the Archbishop of Canterbury, in consequence of the death of the prelate that had been appointed in England while waiting at Rome for his ordination. To reconcile King Oswy to his assumption, he, the Pope, sent him a flattering letter with a choice collection of his trumpery relics, and his spiritual daughter, the Queen, he sent a cross and a golden key enriched with a portion of the filings of Peter's noted chain. Theodore, after having his head shaved according to Roman law, was dispatched to England. We're going to talk about this more. Having his head shaved according to Roman law. This has to do with the so-called ecclesiastical tonsure, or the ecclesiastical special haircut. Let me just explain to start with, so you understand, so you don't get lost. There were three special haircuts that were worn in the Eastern and the Western empires. The Eastern priests, ecclesiastics, shaved their heads, completely shaved their heads bald. That was their ecclesiastical tonsure, or their special ecclesiastical haircut. There was another special haircut that was worn by those of Scotland and Ireland, which was a shaving of the foreportion of the head. In other words, from the brow back to an area, if you were to draw an imaginary line between the tip of your left ear straight over the top of your head to the tip of your right ear, all of the hair forward of that line was to be shaved. That's how they wore their ecclesiastical tonsure in Scotland and Ireland. Okay. Now, the third is the Roman ecclesiastical tonsure, which was to shave the crest of one's head, a circle, or rather make bald the top of the head, leaving all the hair in the back and the sides and the sideburns, so that when you finished the haircut, shaving the crown or the crest of the head, just as typical in male pattern balding, what you have left is hair around the sides and the back of the head, representing of the likeness of the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. Okay, three ecclesiastical tonsures. And whichever tonsure or haircut you wore identified you as to what part of the empire you were from, and whose authority you acknowledged. Okay? So those in the East who had shaved their whole head were acknowledging the power vested in Constantinople. All right? The Archbishop of Constantinople, the hierarch of Constantinople, who, if you will remember, was a rivalry between Constantinople and Rome, both struggling to achieve and attain universal bishopric status. Okay, we've covered that thoroughly. There was competition early between the Eastern ecclesiastics and the Papacy in Rome over supremacy. And at first, the emperors of the Roman Empire of Constantinople acknowledged the Bishop of Constantinople as the supreme bishop. And Rome struggled to overturn that decision and covet and receive ecclesiastical supremacy for itself, and thus rendering the ecclesiastical hierarchy in Constantinople to be his vassal. Okay, power struggle. This is just more emphasis of the fact that the papacy is not a divine institution. This is a man-made institution that has used every means of intrigue to achieve its temporal and spiritual status in the world. Okay, now there's a competition also between Rome and the hierarchical structure of Britain and Scotland. And these are the subjects that we're discussing today. How the papacy asserted itself over all of its rivals, okay, for the end result of achieving universal temporal status, King of Kings status. Okay, now to continue, he says, let me just back up a little bit to make sure we're not lost here. Now, to reconcile King Oswy to his assumption, he, the Pope, sent him a flattering letter with a choice of collection of his trumpery relics, in other words, gifts, holy relics, and to his spiritual daughter, the Queen, he sent a cross and a golden key enriched with a portion of the filings of Peter's noted chain. Remember, that was one of the holy relics that Rome offered the Archbishop of Constantinople when they wanted to consecrate their great cathedral of St. Paul in Constantinople, and they wanted to consecrate the building and to put beneath the altar a relic such as is the custom of heathen temples, some holy relic. Well, they beseeched the Pope for a piece of Paul's body, supposedly, the Apostle Paul's body. Well, of course, the papacy went to great lengths to say that they couldn't even approach that sepulcher of the holy St. Paul without some calamity resulting, so they simply would take filings from a chain that Peter was supposed to have been bound with at the time of his so-called assassination in Rome, and these were to be the relics, okay? So it became a big gift from the Pope to take some filings off of this chain, and that's what was used to ingratiate the Pope with the King and his Queen in England. He said, therefore, Theodore, after having his head shaved according to the Roman law, was dispatched to England and forthwith acknowledged in consequence of his having been chosen and ordained by the successor of St. Peter, that is the Pope, as the primate of all England. So now we have, rather than the temporal authority of Great Britain appointing a bishop over Canterbury, we have the Pope himself appointing a bishop over Canterbury. Okay, and what does that tell you about the bishop? He's a temporal sovereign. Okay? You might call him a bishop as a religious head, but in Roman Catholic canon law, he is a temporal ruler as well. Okay, so now we have the Pope selecting a temporal ruler to rule over Canterbury in England. This is how the Pope struggles and digs and claws with every kind of intrigue to achieve temporal sovereign status all over the world. And he does that by selecting the hierarchy of every nation. Now, we're recording in history. We're reading the account in history of excuse me, of a precedent that's being established by the papacy. The papacy is asserting to itself sole responsibility, sole power to appoint ecclesiastical heads, bishops, archbishops, the whole lot. And this is not left anymore to the governments of those countries to select their own heads of the church. Okay? Listen, this is easy to understand. If the government of the nation selects the ecclesiastical heads of the church, then that makes the temporal sovereign of that nation supreme. Well, the Pope needs supremacy over that temporal head in every nation of the world. So the Pope, in order to achieve this, he asserts to pick all of his bishops and all of his ecclesiastics, taking that responsibility and that power away from the temporal power and giving it to the Pope himself. Okay, so the Pope is naming the bishops and ordaining the bishops and the heads of the church. So that makes the Pope superior over the king, right? Do you see the process that's taking place, the precedent that is taking place? This is how the papacy achieves temporal status over the established government of every country by asserting to himself the sole prerogative of electing ecclesiastical hierarchs who are, in fact, temporal sovereigns under the Pope. In other words, the papacy is regime changing. When the papacy has the power to appoint these ecclesiastical heads, he is usurping the authority of the established government of that country. And this is the grave dispute currently between the Roman Catholic Church, or the papacy, and China, because China knows that if the government relinquishes its power to appoint the ecclesiastical heads, it is giving up its temporal sovereignty to the Pope. If the Chinese government allows the Pope to appoint the ecclesiastical heads of the church in China, the government of China has given over its power, given its power and strength to the beast. Maybe China's wiser than the United States and Great Britain and Scotland and England and Ireland and the whole world. Maybe China is wiser than the whole Christian world. And this is the great bone of contention between the papacy and the government of China to this day. The Pope is denied the power and the authority to pick his ecclesiastical heads. And I call them his ecclesiastical heads because the Pope says he is the only power on earth that can appoint church leadership. He's the only one in the world that can ordain a bishop. And China says, no, we pick our own bishops. They're going to be loyal to us and our temporal authority, and not the head of a foreign state in Rome. Okay, we're not going to give up sovereignty of our nation by allowing the Pope to overthrow our power by appointing his own bishops in China. Now, I have to ask the question to my listeners. Who picks the bishops for the United States of America? Does the government? Who picks the religious hierarchy for the United States of America? The Pope. And when the Pope picks an ecclesiastical head for the United States of America, they go to Rome for their ordination, and they come back a vassal of the Pope, not of the government. They're not loyal to this country. They're loyal only to the Pope. And that's how, virtually that is how, the power and strength of this nation has been overthrown and usurped by the papacy. And that is precisely why the United States of America has become the world's policeman, overthrowing temporal governments de facto and conforming them to de jure governments for Rome. That's what the entire industrial military complex of the United States is devoted to. Now our government would tell us that we go and fight all these foreign wars to extend independence and democracy in those nations. How can that be so if what results after regime change imposed by the United States on foreign governments, all of a sudden they have a government that is friendly to the Roman Catholic Church, and that Rome picks the bishops and controls the country? The United States of America is the battle axe for the papacy. The United States of America and her allies are continuing the precedent that is being set right here in the reading of this book. The Pope picks the ecclesiastics. And the ecclesiastics of every nation, as picked and ordained by the Pope, become the shadow government in every nation, riding herd and changing and watching over the government of that nation to make sure that it obeys the papacy. And if it does not obey the papacy, then there's some kind of intrigue, there's some kind of assassination, or some kind of regime change instigated by the papacy to replace that government. Okay? The shadow government in every nation is the Roman Catholic hierarchy. They are temporal sovereigns. They answer to no one but the Pope. Despite what you may hear or see them say on television or radio, their loyalty lies with the papacy, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. They believe they occupy a divine right status, and that the temporal governments of every land must impose Roman Catholic canon law upon its citizenry. Okay? So this, now, what we're reading, this digging and scratching and clawing and climbing to its own temporal sovereignty in the world, has come to full fruition in our age. It's a precedent that is being set right here in the reading of this book that is still present in the world today. The precedent that the Pope picks the ecclesiastics for every country. And now he's going to do it in Great Britain. He says, Theodore, after having shaved his head according to the Roman law, was dispatched to England, and forthwith acknowledged in consequence of his having been chosen and ordained by the successor of St. Peter, that's by the Pope, not by the King or the Queen of England, but by the Pope, as the primate of all England. Okay? What does that do to the government of England? It renders it null and void. If it still exists, it's just a figure to deceive the people. The primate of all England was Theodore, who was appointed by the Pope. So you see the government of England clandestinely being overthrown simply by allowing the Pope to appoint the ecclesiastical hierarch for England. And he says, from that time to the present, the Archbishop of Canterbury has enjoyed a degree of power and authority in Great Britain superior to that of any other ecclesiastic in the realm. So who's the most powerful man in Great Britain? The divinely appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, the vassal of the Pope. Now, we've just given you one example, just one example of the diabolical intrigue of the papacy and his use of ordination of the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the country to overthrow the civil government. That's how he does it. Now, the King and Queen of England received flatteries and gifts by the self-styled Vicar of Christ in Rome, the papacy. And thinking him to be somebody, they were flattered and impressed with his gifts. And so they conceded to allow this demon in Rome to pick the shadow government, the hierarch of the shadow government, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury oversees the government to make sure that the King of England and the Queen of England remained the vassals of the papacy. If they had never conceded to be vassals of the papacy, the Archbishop of Canterbury is there to make sure that they do not get out of line, that they toe the line. Rome is in control because Rome has picked the Archbishop of Canterbury, not the King and Queen. England's, because of flattery and because of impressive gifts, surrendered their sovereignty and power and authority and lent it to the beast, who then appointed his own hierarch of Great Britain, of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope says whenever he appoints a hierarch of his church, it becomes the temporal sovereign of that country. The Archbishop of Canterbury now wields power over all the ecclesiastical members in England and over the government. This is what happens when you receive flatteries and gifts from the papacy. You know, flattery is the most easily identifiable characteristic of Satan. Do you realize that in the Garden of Eden, the serpent used flattery to beat down Adam and Eve's defenses? What did Satan say? What did the serpent say to Adam and Eve? Why, you shall not surely die. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be as gods, knowing both good and evil, if you eat of this tree. Wow. Really? And they did eat, and their eyes were opened. And we're living the consequences of the serpent's initial flatteries of Adam and Eve. All humanity has suffered because by receiving the gift of these flatteries from the serpent, all of human history has suffered the consequence. Be careful from whom you receive flatteries, because behind it, if you're careful to look, you'll find the serpent almost every time. Flattery is used most basically by the serpent to deceive God's people. And that's why I don't receive flatteries and gifts from people. I don't ask for flatteries and gifts. That's why I am able here on First Amendment Radio to say anything and everything that the Spirit of God puts upon my heart. I'm not here to win friends and influence people. I'm not here to get rich and powerful and wealthy and popular. I'm here to tell the truth. Flattery and gifts will get you nothing but perdition. When someone comes to you with a flattering tongue and a gift, they are there to make you a vassal. And if you find someone giving you flatteries and gifts and trying to impress you with all kinds of compliments, be very careful, because that individual is most likely trying to make you a vassal, to make you repay the compliment, to repay the flattery. They expect to receive in kind that which they have given. They have an ulterior motive. And it's the most easily definable characteristic of intrigue and flattery. And we have the first example of it right in the Garden of Eden. And this is the very example that the papacy consistently uses to overthrow governments in the world. Just as the serpent overthrew the government of God over Adam and Eve. It's a not perfectly identifiable positive characteristic of the Antichrist. no one should be surprised that the papacy uses the same intrigue of flattery and gifts as did the serpent in the garden. That's another positive identification characteristic of Antichrist. He follows the same modus operandi as did the serpent in the garden, by first flattering and giving gifts. Now, because King Oswey and his queen were flattered by the compliments and the gifts of the papacy gave the king and the queen a gift. It's called the Archbishop of Canterbury, by which the Vatican literally overthrew the government. The Archbishop of Canterbury became the most powerful person in all of Great Britain, including the king and the queen. Now again, you have to ask yourself, what could possibly be the condition of the United States of America, since the papacy picks all of the hierarchy in the United States? The answer is obvious. Our government kowtows to the papacy, and if any one member of that government displeases the papacy, then it is up to the Roman Catholic hierarchs of this country to see that they are done away with. And we have the best case available in that of President John F. Kennedy. President John F. Kennedy, at some point in his presidency early on, decided to go to war against the papacy. We've already discussed that the Vietnam War was nothing but a Roman Catholic crusade to overthrow the legitimate government rather, according to Rome's definition, the de facto government of Vietnam, and to be replaced with a Roman Catholic government. So the United States went on the battle wagon to overthrow that government, and John Kennedy became somehow knowledgeable that it was a Roman Catholic crusade, that this Protestant nation had literally been overthrown and taken over by the Roman Catholic hierarchy to go on a Roman Catholic crusade to Catholicize Vietnam. And that's why John F. Kennedy tried to end the war in Vietnam. And that's why he's died. That's why he's dead. He went to war against the papacy. John F. Kennedy tried to destroy the CIA, which must have been blatantly obvious to JFK that it was dominated by Roman Catholics. It was controlled by Cardinal Spellman. That in the case of the CIA, President John F. Kennedy was not a president of the CIA. Cardinal Spellman was. And it was through the CIA, the Roman Catholic CIA, that the Vietnam War was progressing. So John F. Kennedy went against the Roman Catholic hierarchy of the CIA and tried to obliterate that organization. Now, I'm really only going to touch on a few of these, but that's why John F. Kennedy's dead. He opposed the papacy. He opposed the Roman Catholic hierarchy of this country. He tried to end the Roman Catholic crusade, the co-opting of all the valuable resources of this country to go on a crusade to change the de facto government of Vietnam into a Roman Catholic government. The papacy even selected the president of Vietnam, No Dinh Diem, and Diem was his name. He was in training to be a Roman Catholic priest. Instead, the Vatican put him as their vassal in Vietnam. So you're never going to hear this in the press, but it's not hard to figure out. So this is what happens when the Pope picks your archbishops. This is why China refuses to relinquish that power to the Vatican. And for darn good reason. There must be somewhere in China more good sense than there is anywhere in the Christian world. because they refuse to relinquish to the papacy the power to elect the ecclesiastical hierarchs of China. They have wisdom beyond anyone in the Christian world. In the Christian world, they allow the papacy freely to elect and to appoint all of his ecclesiastical hierarchs. No government in the Christian world rejects the papacy's power to pick their bishops. They all invite the papacy to pick his own hierarchs, who will then become the shadow government of every country to make sure that government still obeys the papacy. China's smarter than that. You got to hand it to China. Whatever else you may think of China, at least they have good sense enough not to allow their temporal sovereignty to be handed over voluntarily without a fight to the God of this world, the papacy. They've got more sense than any government in the Christian world. Shocking reality. But where we've just read the precedent of what happens in a country when you allow the Pope to pick the Roman Catholic hierarchy of that country, the government of England is overthrown. Now we're going to proceed to subsection 5. This is again page 136 if you're following along. He says, as a specimen of the important matters of disputation which in this age were regarded as of sufficient importance to divide the ignorant priests and monks into opposite and contending parties, may be mentioned the famous dispute in England relative to what is called the ecclesiastical tonsure. Now, I explained this before. My explanation will help to make sense now. This is an ecclesiastical haircut. Okay, it's an outward sign of the ecclesiastical hierarchy, who they serve. You want to know who that ecclesiastical hierarch served at this time? Just look at his haircut. His haircut alone will tell you who he is a vassal of. He says, in plain English, the manner in which the priests should shave their heads. Okay, that's what an ecclesiastical tonsure is. He says, when the missionaries who came over to Britain from Rome about the middle of the 7th century encountered Scottish and Irish priests, they were horrified at the terrible discovery that the British clergy, instead of a circular tonsure on the occiput, that is the very top of the head, a bald spot on the top of their head, were distinguished by a tonsure or a haircut on the forehead in the shape of a crescent. Okay, this is the one that I described earlier, where if you were to draw an imaginary line from the tip of your left ear straight up across the top of your head to the corresponding tip of the right ear, and then shave all the hair forward of that imaginary line. That is the crescent-shaped tonsure that the Roman Catholic hierarchs were shocked when they saw it. Okay? That's the wrong haircut. You don't serve Rome, you serve someone else, right? And he says, and this was the momentous cause of the fierce controversy that ensued between the two parties. Quote, the grand question was, according to the historian Bauer, whether the hair of the priest and the monk should be clipped or shaved on the forepart of the head from ear to ear in the form of a semicircle, or on the top of the head in the form of a circle to imitate the crown of thorns which our Savior wore, and of which was thought to be an emblem. The Scots shaved the forepart of their heads, in other words, from that imaginary line from tip to tip of the ear forward was shaved by the Scots, and the missionaries from Rome, the top, in other words, just the top of the head was shaved, and calling that the tonsure of St. Peter, as if it had been derived from that apostle. Now, let me just stop and tell you. Let me just ask you a question, an obvious question. When and where in the Scriptures did Jesus instruct the apostles how to shave their heads? Anywhere? There's nowhere in the Scripture. The ecclesiastical tonsure is not a divine institution. It's a man-made institution. As a matter of fact, these special haircuts preceded Christ by centuries, by millennia, okay? These special haircuts were worn by the occultic, barbarian priests of the ancient Gentile world who worshipped images and idols, who worshipped Nimrod, who worshipped Saturn and Jupiter and Venus and all the other pagan gods of the ancient pagan world. And believe it or not, if you will just believe me, the official Roman Catholic Encyclopedia, the 1907 to 1913 official Roman Catholic Encyclopedia, acknowledges the heathen origin of the vestments, the haircuts, the traditions, the holidays, and all of Roman Catholicism. They admit it in their own encyclopedia. This has nothing whatsoever to do with Christ. That's because the Roman Catholic Church has nothing whatsoever to do with Christ. It has everything whatsoever to do with the Antichrist, the Papacy. It's nothing but ancient Babylonian, Persian, Grecian paganism baptized with the name Christianity, and the whole world wonders after the beast. Right down to the very haircuts. You still looking for a future Antichrist, or have we had one all along? He says the Scots shaved the forepart of their heads, and the missionaries from Rome the top, calling that the tonsure of St. Peter as if it had been derived from that apostle. You wonder, suppose, that some of the great sages of the Roman Catholic Church could sip a little cognac or something and transport themselves back to the time of the ancient apostle Peter and take a quick, careful look at his haircut and cut their hair exactly the same way as he did? Rome would have you believe just about any kind of nonsense such as this. All right? When, by whom, or on what occasion the ecclesiastical tonsure, the special ecclesiastical haircut, that is, the clipping or the shaving of the hair of the ecclesiastics, was first introduced, is not well known. Well, look. If Rome admits in their own encyclopedia that these traditions of the Roman Catholic Church come from the ancient pagans, I'd say that comes from a very good authority, wouldn't you? This author says how these special haircuts were introduced is not well known, but Rome admits where they come from. All right, he says, but certain it is that in the time of St. Jerome, who flourished in the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century, a Romish priest with his shaven crown would have been taken for a priest of Isis or Serapis, if that's how you want to pronounce it. In other words, a pagan priest. He says, a shaven crown being then, as that further informs us, the characteristic or badge of those priests. There you have it. A perfect acknowledgement that the ecclesiastical tonsure, whether it's shaving the crescent on the top of your head, or shaving the hair on the forehead, or shaving bald, is simply a haircut worn by the ancient priests who worshipped Isis and Serapis. It's pagan tradition. Not a thing Christian about it. But you'll find that the Roman Catholic hierarchy still to this day wear these ecclesiastical tonsures, these special haircuts, making an open testimony of who they really serve. He says, as for the Christian priests who were neither to shave their heads, as we learn from the same father, the same historian, lest they should look too like the priests and the votaries of Isis and Serapis, nor to suffer their hair to grow long after the luxurious manner of the barbarians and soldiers, but to observe a decent mean between the two extremes. That is, he explains it, to let their hair grow long enough to cover their skin. It was therefore probably the custom to cut their hair to a moderate degree at their ordination, not by way of a religious mystery, but merely for the sake of decency, and that nothing else was originally meant by the ecclesiastical tonsure. However that be, the cutting of the hair was, and in the process of time, improved into a mystery, and the heathenish ceremony of shaving the head not only adopted by the church, but looked upon as important enough to divide it, unquote. And now the author gives on the following page visible examples of these three different ecclesiastical tonsures, these ecclesiastical special haircuts that are derived from nothing but the worship of ancient pagan deities, the tradition of the ancient priests of the pagan world. And they still argue and fight about these ridiculous haircuts. And they call themselves a Christian church. And for the most part, the whole world believes it's a Christian church, when in fact it is the synagogue of Satan. Now, subsection 6 reads thus: a curious illustration of the importance attached to this foolish custom of shaving the head in a particular manner is connected with the ordination of Theodore above referred to, that is, of England, and is related upon the authority of the venerable historian Bede. In the year 667 A.D., Oswy, the king of England, and Egbert, the kings of Northumberland and Kent in England, dispatched Wigert, a man by the name of Wigard, a newly elected Archbishop of Canterbury, to receive his ordination from the hands of the Pope, with a present to St. Peter of several valuable articles of silver and gold. Wigard, dying of the plague which then raged at Rome, the Pope resolved to embrace the favorable opportunity of advancing his power, his temporal power, remember, he's already got spiritual power, to advancing his temporal power by choosing an archbishop himself, instead of sending to the two kings to request them, according to the previous custom, or the previous, what's the word I used earlier? The previous precedent to elect a successor of Wigard. So here is the precedent-setting change. Instead of the king appointing the ecclesiastical heads of Britain, it is now the Pope who is picking this head. This is the example of how the government of England was overthrown by the papacy, a precedent that was set then that is still observed and honored and respected today. Who is the king of Great Britain? Who is the real king of Great Britain? Precedent is determined that the Pope is the king of Great Britain, just as he is the king of the United States. We'll be back tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.